Welcome, everybody, to this seminar, this webinar, I should say, the Centre for European Reform. I'm Charles Grant, the Director of the CER. We're here to discuss today what the new Labour government is likely to do on the European Union questions and what it should do as well. We've got three excellent panelists to help us answer these questions today. One is David Lidington, former Europe Minister, who was Europe Minister for longer than anyone else in history of the United Kingdom. The second person we have is Catherine Barnard, a Professor of Law at Cambridge University, who's a great expert on all things European. And the third person who will be joining us shortly is Stella Creasy, the Chairman of the Labour Movement for Europe and MP for Walthamstow. Stella will be with us in a little while, we believe. So let's kick off. After I've asked our panelists to make a few opening remarks, roughly 5 or 7 minutes each, we'll then go into some questions. I hope some of the questions we'll consider will be things like the security pact that David Lammy's promised with EU. What should that consist of? What is a security pact? How much can the trade relationship be improved, given that Labour has set red lines, which we all know are no customs union, no single market, no freedom of movement? What can be done to work together on migration? And how, particularly interesting for me, is how the European Union governments will react to new initiatives from Labour. What do they think about the new European government? And also, to what extent the geopolitical context will colour the future of the UK-EU relationship, with the world a much darker place than it was at the time of the EU referendum in 2016. That's enough from me. I'll turn now firstly to David. Would David like to kick us off? What do you think the Labour government will be up to? What should it be doing?
Well, I think it's very clear to me that they're going to use the meeting of the European political community at Blenheim Palace next week to set out their stall, and the pitch will be that this is a government that wants a close, constructive, mutually beneficial partnership with our biggest trading partner, our next door neighbour, and that this government is not going to include people who get neuralgic about any mention of the word Europe in policy. But when you look at the substance, I think that we know that the Labour Party is committed to seeking a defence, security, sort of cooperative relationship with the EU. This was something, of course, which was in the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration accompanying the withdrawal agreement that was agreed to by Boris Johnson and Lord Frost. But it's something that's never been acted upon. So I think this seems to me, particularly in the light of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, to be a sensible, pragmatic way forward. The devil, as always, will be in the detail, but I think that initiative will be very warmly welcomed by the Central and Northern European countries in particular. I think Keir Starmer, while leader of the opposition, had already developed very good lines into the Social Democratic Party in Germany, including with Chancellor Scholz and his key advisors. I think you'll get a welcome for this in Germany as well. The reality is that you cannot talk seriously about anything labelled a European pillar of NATO or a European foreign defence and security policy unless both the United Kingdom and France are involved. I mean, they're the two countries that have still significant military assets, a global view, and a willingness to deploy those military assets. I mean, Germany is not yet, although it's changed and changing, Germany is not yet in the same position of having that public support for willingness to act militarily in defence of German interests. So I think there'll be moves forward on that, but I put in a caveat, which is that a key element of the European Union's work on security and defence policy in the term of the new Commission is going to be on defence industries, because what Ukraine war has shown is that the European defence industry is fragmented, that none of us, in or out of the EU, have enough ammunition and other munitions available to cope with the depletion rates, which the Ukraine war has shown are a part of modern warfare, particularly if you're up against Putin. And certainly the French approach to defence industries is to say, yes, we need to have EU sovereign capacity, with strategic autonomy, control over our own lines of supply with defence industries. Therefore, there should be, in practice, a buy EU first policy, which is code for buy French. And the Nordics, the Baltics are already a bit sceptical of this. So it's not something that Paris can guarantee will get agreement within the EU. But there's clearly a question there as to how easy it will be for the United Kingdom to persuade the EU institutionally and collectively that we and our defence industry should be part of any such setup. If you move to the sort of commercial trading relationship, I think that Starmer, having set his red lines, is going to try to achieve improvements within that, and there are quite a large number of incremental improvements which it would be possible to make. I think Labour will quietly align with EU regulatory standards in certain sectors of industry, and that means that the UK business would no longer have to manufacture its widgets to meet two distinct EU ones because of the scale of the EU market and separate UK standards. But what that won't do is automatically increase that single market, because you still have to show then at the border that each consignment has widgets that have met those EU standards, and you have to go through all the paperwork with rules of origin and so on. So you'd avoid duplication in meeting separate standards and expense that goes with that, but it doesn't restore the seamless trade we had when we were full members of the European single market. And there's some similar, I think, sort of policy choices to be made when it comes to what Labour has flagged as one of its key ambitions, which is to have an agreement on sanitary phytosanitary standards, so to animal health, veterinary and plant medicines to help the food and agricultural sectors. And there's a broad choice of models here. That the New Zealanders have a model that in practice means that they and the EU recognise each other's standards. Switzerland has a model where in practice Switzerland is dynamically aligned to EU standards. And the Sunak government, I think, would quietly have been content to get mutual recognition, but was balked at any idea of aligning with EU standards. And if you're in Brussels or Paris and you're looking at the United Kingdom as a big producer of food and drink, what is the advantage to you and your farmers in sort of mutual recognition? And so, given the Swiss precedent, my expectation, I hope I'm wrong, but my expectation would be that the EU position would be, if you want this, it's dynamic alignment is the sort of deal that we are prepared to offer. And I think that more generally, I'll just finish on this point. There is a challenge for the UK and for Keir Starmer in the extent to which the EU has moved on since the referendum and since the exit from membership of the European Union. Every one of the 6 monthly rotating EU presidencies publishes a document listing its presidency priorities. If you read those, the United Kingdom is barely mentioned. And it usually, if we're mentioned at all, it's a little paragraph somewhere else about page 10, and says something like, we will work for a constructive relationship with the United Kingdom in accordance with the withdrawal agreement and political declaration and in conformity with the European treaties. And if you talk to I talk to some of my former EU ministerial counterparts, and they will say, look, we've got other things that we worry about. They're much less time thinking, worrying about the United Kingdom, its relationship with the EU. Some of your newspapers in London do. So the Daily Express headlines about conspiracies in Brussels to pull us back into the EU's orbit are pretty far-fetched, because actually the challenge is going to be to get their attention and persuade them to commit themselves to serious negotiations on the detail of an improved relationship. Now, I still very much think that is something that's worth doing, and I would wish the new team well and success in seeking to achieve that. But I don't think we should ignore the fact that each EU country and the institutions of the EU will have a conception of their own interests. And they will be trying to work out in any conversation with the UK how their interest as France, as Lithuania, as Slovenia, or as the EU sitting in the Commission or European Parliament would benefit from a change in the current relationship. They think the current system is really advantageous to the European Union, and therefore the owners they I think they're starting with the onus is on us to show why we should change those parameters. Having said that, what Keir has got going for him is that I do think that the invasion of Ukraine was a massive wake-up call for every European capital. And I think that, and add into that the fears about the potential election of President Trump for a second term. And there is an opportunity there, but I don't think we should assume that the 27 and the institutions of the EU are somehow waiting with bated breath to welcome us back in. I think they've got plenty else on their plate. And so, I think this is largely going to be a story of incremental improvements and some quite tricky technical negotiations.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome to Stella. Thank you for joining us, Stella. We're coming now to Catherine, then we'll come to Stella. For Stella's benefit, we're trying to answer the opening question is, what will the UK government try and do vis-a-vis Europe, and what should it do? But David mentioned the technical difficulties of renegotiating aspects of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Nobody's better to understand those technicalities than Catherine Barnard. Catherine, how does it look to you? You tend to always say how difficult it's going to be. Is that your mood today?
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation. I think I have a number of points to make. First of all, starting with the positive, which is I think the tone has already improved significantly. I think the fact that David Lammy's one of the first things he did was to go to Germany and to make warm remarks about a warmer and closer relationship with the EU, all of that is really positive. And I think it's already sending out a message. This is a new government with a new approach to Europe. And obviously the EPC will give the opportunity to set out what that might mean in more concrete terms. Now, let's look a bit at some of the nuts and bolts. Let's assume that there is a desire to do new things, albeit obviously no customs union, no single market. The first vehicle which might allow that is in the context of the Article 776 review, but the Article 776 review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is a review of its implementation, not a review of its substance. And within the substance of the TCA, there is the trade and cooperation, there is space to do things, most importantly, mutual recognition of professional qualifications. But the trouble is, there is a hell of a lot of slog to get there. If you look at the equivalent provisions in the EU-Canada agreement, it took the best part of 10 iterations and a number of years to get to any agreement on architects. And so while it will be nice to do things on mutual recognition of qualifications, it's a really hard piece of work. So more interesting then is not just to look what can be done within the TCA, but what can be done outside the TCA. Now, the reason I raise that is because within the TCA, it was always envisaged that additional agreements could be bolted on. And indeed, if you think of this TCA like a very large sandwich, the bread on the sandwich was the framework into which both the existing TCA and any bolt-on agreements fit. The problem is that the framework, that the bread on the sandwich, is actually quite limiting, because the remedies provisions are essentially international dispute settlement style, and there's no role for the European Court of Justice. Now, obviously, that was a conscious choice on the part of the negotiators, but it does mean that deeper integration is not possible within the framework of the TCA, because the EU would require a role for the European Court of Justice, and that's not possible within the TCA. And so then the question is, how much scope is there for separate bilateral agreements outside the framework of the TCA, which creates a space for the European Court of Justice to have a role? And this becomes more relevant when we start thinking about more serious cooperation with the EU. Now, what might that more serious cooperation look like? Of course, imagine everyone who's listening to this today will be aware of the Barnier staircase. That was the different levels of intensity of cooperation. And of course, legally speaking, that Barnier staircase was absolutely right in terms of the proximity of relationship. And as you know, we ended up at the bottom, which is exactly where Monsieur Barnier thought we would be. There is a question about the fact that whether the EU has moved on beyond the Barnier staircase. And actually, the time has come for a bit of reflection about whether the Barnier staircase is the only particular points of engagement with the EU. And this will become more acute when serious endeavours are made to start negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, because the commitments that they will have to undertake by 2030 is so great that it looks like there will maybe some form of new relationship with the EU. And if that is the case, then that raises a question about the age-old question about concentric circles. So I realise this is rather technical, but what I'm saying is that we have to think about whether the arrangements are confined to the TCA, in which case they won't be very deep because there will be no role for the European Court of Justice, or whether they will be deeper, in which case they need to be freestanding agreements, which may well lead to a role for the European Court of Justice. And that brings me on to the next question, which is the area of youth mobility, or mobility more generally. Now, we know that the Labour Party have ruled out single market. I should say, just as a footnote, there is no possibility of joining the single market in and of itself. It doesn't actually exist as a thing. The only way we could have full access to the single market in the existing relationships is if we join the EEA, the European Economic Area. But we know that Labour have ruled out single market. We know they've also ruled out free movement, which brings us back to the youth mobility proposal that the Commission put out in May. I think the timing of that couldn't have been worse. And of course, we know that the Conservative Party rejected it within minutes, and Labour rejected it within very few minutes after that. Now, it is worth remembering it wasn't a proposal, it was a proposal for a proposal for the Commission to get agreement to negotiate with the UK. We also know it was done in part strategically because they were concerned about the fact that the UK was trying to pick off favoured states to do bilateral arrangements with, and the EU was having none of it. It's all 27 or nothing. But nevertheless, within that agreement, it was an extremely ambitious agreement, but it would have been a very good thing for young people. And it would have been an extremely good thing, I must say, and I declare an interest here, for universities, because universities have really suffered from the loss of EU students. And one of the things in the proposal for a proposal was that EU students would get home fees rather than overseas fees. But it would also mean that Horizon and our accession to Horizon would make much more sense, because, of course, at the moment, the free movement of researchers is not possible for us under Horizon, because any researcher coming has to have a visa, and our visa fees are many, many, many times higher than in any other member state. The other advantage about some sort of youth mobility program, particularly, or youth mobility scheme, particularly if it was a freestanding one, is it might in part help to address some of the issues with artists and musicians who have been very badly affected. And the reason why artists and musicians have been very badly affected is that under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, you can move in certain capacities, provided you're on a list, and musicians and artists are not on any of the relevant lists. So I, as an academic, could move to another country under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement because academics, researchers are on the list, but musicians, artists are not on any list, and therefore they can't take advantage of the provisions in the TCA. So if there was appetite, and that's a big if there was appetite for having some sort of youth mobility agreement, a freestanding probably youth mobility agreement, it might be a way of including musicians, artists, and crucially researchers, which is what we need very much in order to get Horizon to work for us. I emphasize its youth mobility, and what people don't seem to understand is youth mobility is different to free movement, because free movement led to settlement. Youth mobility absolutely will not lead to settlement because it will be there for a maximum period of 4 years. And there is no provision, even in the ambitious proposal that the Commission put forward, for any form of settlement whatsoever. Mobility is different to movement. And I think from that point of view, it is important that with the change of government, all of us need to engage in different ways of thinking, that the ERG, the European Research Group, is no longer calling the shots in the way that it did in the period 2016 to 2019. And crucially, I think businesses and, dare I say it, universities may well start speaking up to say, look, we can get this relationship to work, but the thing that we particularly need to get working is, in particular, issues about mobility going forward. Yes, of course, it's sensitive, but on the other hand, there are benefits on both sides. I'll stop there.
Myself. Thank you, Catherine. I turn now to Stella. Stella, you in the past have sometimes said that you would wish the Labour Party leadership be a bit bolder and braver when it comes to thinking about relations with the European Union. Is that still your view, or are you optimistic that they may be listening to some of your ideas?
Well, I've always been a fan of thinking big, Charles, as you know. But I think this is a very interesting period of time, because in some ways, Europe has become the Schrodinger's cat of British politics. Let me explain what I mean by that. In some senses, nothing may happen very quickly, and in other senses, big things may happen very quickly. And it's very difficult at the moment to determine what's going to happen. Why do I think nothing might happen very quickly? I agree very much with some of the things that Catherine and David have said. I look at the Hungarian presidency, and you could already see that Europe is sort of going, well, that's 6 months out because we're not dealing with Orban, we're not dealing, this is not good for us. Obviously, there's uncertainty about what might happen in America, which creates further friction about what you could do that could be bold and visionary in Europe. The situation following the European elections, I mean, I think one of the challenges perhaps in the UK is sometimes we act like Brexit just happened to us, but of course it was about two sides of a relationship. So what is happening in Europe? So post the French presidential elections, it's not just in France, it's in Germany, it's what happened to the results in Denmark, in Switzerland. It's, only really the Portuguese progressives feel that they had a good night. So that clearly, again, creates a sense of uncertainty about doing something different. The ongoing situation in Ukraine, clearly what's happening in Israel, Gaza. So there are plenty of things happening. David's absolutely right. Europe has got a lot on its plate already, and indeed has been thinking about its own future independently of what happens to the United Kingdom. One of the reasons why I keep telling people in the UK Parliament to stop talking about the single market is nobody really actually knows where the single market will go. The letter review proposed all sorts of issues about what could happen to the single market. So the idea that we know what it would be if we were to seek to rejoin is for the birds. But all of those are reasons why, in the first instance, nothing, say, Schrodinger's cat, nothing may happen. On the other side of the balance sheet is all the crises to come. There are immediate crises. So, for example, within the next 2 weeks, the invoices for the Brexit border tax will drop, which will mean that there are thousands of importers of food to the United Kingdom who are about to get a very big undefined bill for the Brexit border control charges, for a system which I know, because all throughout the election campaign, I had plaintive emails from various importers about just how awful the system was, has been deeply, deeply dysfunctional. The new government has to make a decision about what happens with this system, because it's clearly untenable and unsustainable and is already an inflationary measure. It is about to get a lot worse because of the chaos. And I know a lot of companies are starting to say, well, we may pull out of bringing food to the United Kingdom at all, given that we are a country that, whilst in the summer it's not too bad, we grow a lot of food, by autumn it will be a real crisis and you'll see huge amounts of food shortages if it's not dealt with. Many people have already talked about the crisis that's going to happen at our ports with the checks in terms of passports, and again, the amount of money that's cost, the delays that you're going to see in travel. Obviously, we've already talked about Ukraine and the defence. You've got Keir today at NATO. I'm sure that will be a key issue about the EPC next week. But then you've got some of those issues about growth, because absolutely, as a party and as a government, to demand that we are going to get the fastest growth in the G7 is absolutely the right objective to have. It is possible outside of the European Union, in the same way that it is possible to tie your shoelaces without using your hands. It's just, if you can trade with your neighbours and if you can rebuild your trading relationships, it is much more likely. So what I see is this competing tension between the practicalities of a world in which we blew up our relationship with our nearest neighbours. And I hope David won't mind me saying, you know, post Brexit in the last 5 years, we've made a bad situation fundamentally worse by how we have approached that relationship. So, for example, things like the Brexit border tax are an entirely self-inflicted injury versus the need to act. And I think that's going to lead to some really interesting opportunities. But I start with, in a world where we sent somebody to Brussels who didn't know whether the French were friend or foe, we have a lot of ground to make up with our colleagues in Europe that it's worth talking to us at all. Catherine is right that that may lead to some very technical conversations. I am more hopeful than her that there are opportunities to address some of those issues. Why am I hopeful? Well, partly because of all those crises that are happening. I think actually, for many of our colleagues in Europe, the opportunity of a new incoming progressive government that wants to be a partner, that recognises the shared challenges of our defence, our climate, our security, and indeed trade, offers an opportunity to have conversations about mutual benefit. That this is a different relationship, it's a grown-up relationship, it's not a combative relationship. It's also not one that is seeking to relitigate arguments of 2016 or indeed 2019. It is ruthlessly focused on what could happen next. There is more pragmatically the time and energy that has already been committed to the idea of the TCA review. We know that will be a huge undertaking for the entirety of government and indeed for the EU Commission, whether it has those big ambitions or whether it is simply about reviewing what has already been negotiated. And I've always been a great believer, if you're going to have to put time and effort and energy towards something, you may as well make it count. Where do I think then that Labour can make it count? Well, if I go back to, absolutely, I agree very strongly on defence. We've already seen today some of the conversations about NATO. I think those will get fleshed out in the coming months about what we can all do, not just to challenge Putin and support our colleagues in Ukraine, but more generally address a world that is so deeply unstable and faces a number of shared challenges. And I think that's as much about information flows, it's as much about modern areas of defence and security around cyber warfare as it is about actual troop numbers. I think there are other areas of cooperation that will come. I sit here, I'm a humble backbencher. I hope David wouldn't compare me to the ERG. I'm chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. We are a formal organisation. We're not a ragtag band of a reenactment society. So we are a role within the Labour Party in terms of the conversation about what happens next with Europe. And at the last election, we had 47 of our candidates elected. So we now have a group in Parliament over 100 strong of people who are committed to making this a priority. So saying actually what we want to see is the Labour government resetting that relationship with Europe, but resetting it for 2024. And pragmatically, as I say, that is absolutely about defence. It is also about what trade could look like. even within the confines, I'm more hopeful than Catherine, because I think the EU has shown itself to be much more flexible than people give it credit for. I look at the Windsor Agreement, I look at what's happening with Moldova, and actually there have been plenty of examples where the EU's gone, well, where there are areas of mutual interest, we can find a way forward. So I think that conversation can happen if the work starts now about what we want to do in resolving some of those first order crises. I think that for absolutely an SPS veterinary agreement is the start of it. We would like to see the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention on the table as something that Labour should also be talking about, thinking about, working on, because actually if I look at some of those challenges at the border, then rules of origin questions come into it. And as the Labour Movement for Europe, actually, it's the M that matters most to us, which is about movement and about our colleagues in the businesses and the jobs that are going to be affected by the fact it's so difficult to travel and interact across Europe now. That does bring us to this question of mobility. I am more hopeful than perhaps Catherine that actually there is a conversation to be had about what a mobility scheme would look like. Obviously, we've already talked about it in terms of creative industries. I think there is a challenge there about how do you stop people turning up at the border with a ukulele and saying, well, I should be able to travel because I'm a creative. I think there's also a benefit for Europe, which I think was badly expressed, shall we say, in the youth mobility offer, but it was there nevertheless, about the fact that people do need to be able to travel. And travel is good for study, it's good for work, it's good for relationships. So whilst I didn't think that what was offered as a youth mobility deal to begin with was the right package, I do think it is right that we have that conversation, just as I think we should have that conversation about the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention, just as I think we need to have that conversation about regulatory alignment. David will have enjoyed the experience I had of sitting on a statutory instrument committee just before the election was called, where Kevin Hollinrake explained why actually they had decided after all that the Great British Charter Mark probably wasn't the best idea because it was going to cost British business £1.6 billion a year. We are already aligning on many regulatory standards. I think formalising that would help give British business confidence that we get it, that actually the biggest thing that Brexit has delivered all is more paperwork. And more paperwork is more friction, more frustration, more delay. And in an economy that wants to grow, that wants to invest, what you need to do is reduce that so that you can then get on to thinking about some of those bigger post-Brexit relationships and what that might look like for trade and mutual concern. So I have great hopes, Charles, that we can meet your test about whether or not there is some bold thinking about what could be achieved, even within the parameters now of, well, we've said no single market, no customs union, no freedom of movement. But I also think we have to be acutely aware and respectful of the fact, as David says, that it is not just about us. It is about what else is happening in Europe and where those areas of common concern. I do believe that the border is going to very quickly become an area of common concern. You know, right now there are trucks sitting in lay-bys in Calais with rotting food in. That is in nobody's interests whatsoever. And starting conversations about how we tackle some of those immediate first order problems, I think opens the ground for seeing what grown-up government that recognises the value of cooperation on a range of issues looks like. So I'm hopeful that we can be the Schrodinger's cat that you do see, rather than the one that's in the box that you're not sure whether it's still there.
Thank you very much, Stella. That's great. So we already have a very interesting technical question coming in from Ignacio Garcia Becerro, that until recently was one of the EU Commission's top trade experts. But I'm just going to say a very brief word of my own on why I share Stella's optimism in many respects, and I'm slightly more optimistic than Catherine. I'm usually a bit more optimistic than Catherine. This is three reasons. Firstly, Keir Starmer himself, his character will matter. Character matters in diplomacy. Keir is, in every respect, the opposite of Boris Johnson. I don't have to define what Boris Johnson was. I can define what Keir is. Keir is hardworking, diligent, perhaps a little dull, very serious, focuses on applying the rules strictly. He will focus on results. He wants to get things done. He's not flamboyant. I think that'll go down very well with our EU partners. They didn't. It's no secret they didn't particularly like Boris's character when they dealt with him. I think having a serious, sober, diligent person to deal with will actually make quite a good impression, help to restore trust in the UK. Secondly, as I think Stella already alluded to, the EU actually wants to pick some cherries of its own. They do like to say to us, no cherry picking, but yet they actually have some things they want, and they'll be prepared to bargain with us over who picks whose cherries when. As we've heard, that the EU does want to deal on youth mobility. He wants Britain to rejoin Erasmus. And he wants a deal on fish. If there's no deal on fish come 2026, when the existing arrangements expire, the EU will have to negotiate annually to get fish out of British waters, which is a nightmare for the EU and EU fishermen. So they have things that they want from us, and we have things that we want from them. So I think that actually there will be a bit of give and take, a bit of quid pro quo, a bit of marchandage going on eventually as we get into the negotiation, which makes me optimistic. And of course, countries like the Nordics and the Baltics and the Poles are very keen to allow the British to revisit the economic relationship. The third reason for optimism is in a way, a strange reason. I think the geopolitical context is very dark indeed, and that'll actually help. It may even help if Trump is re-elected to the White House, because Trump freaks out most EU leaders. They're very worried about him and what he might do to the world. They're very worried about Russia. They're very worried about China. They're worried about migration. They're worried about North Africa. They're worried about all sorts of problems in the world and climate change and much else. And they need to, the British actually share most of the fundamental interests and values of our European partners. And I think therefore many people in the EU will want to hug the British close, particularly because of what we can contribute to European security. And we'll come back later in the discussion to the Labour's proposal for a security pact. They want to hug us close. And if they wanted to have a close relationship with us, and the British ask for reopening some of the trade rules under which we operate, I think a lot of them will actually say, well, why not? Because we want the British to be our best friends. So I think for those reasons, Keir's character, the EU's desire for cherry picking, and the geopolitical context, it may be less difficult than we imagined to get a better relationship in the long run, but I accept nothing's going to happen very quickly. That's enough from me. Now I'm going to read out Ignacio's question, which he sent in a moment ago. To Catherine Barnard. Is there any legal obstacle to negotiate an SPS agreement outside the context of the TCA, and including a role for the ECJ, similar to that in the DCFTA with Ukraine? How far can the regulatory cooperation provisions of the TCA go for areas other than SPS? What can the EU do to avoid passive regulatory divergence? I'm going to turn first to Catherine, then I'll happily let David and Stella chip in if they have any thoughts of their own.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for that question, which is immensely helpful. So, as you rightly say, there is a model which Ukraine already has in respect of SPS, but with a role for the ECJ. What is striking is, of course, that the Ukraine model was one of the steps on the Barnier staircase. And of course, it was ruled out by the David Frost because of the very fact that there was a residual limited role for the European Court of Justice. I think what's very encouraging listening to Stella speak is that my reading of what she's saying, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, is one of pragmatism. And if that means a residual role for the ECJ, that may still be possible. It would require considerable bravery from the Labour Party, but it's one of the things that they have not ruled out, unlike ruling out single market and customs union. In fact, there is already a very, very, very residual role, even in respect of Horizon. And so that pass has already been sold, I think. In respect of cooperation under the TCA, in fact, my understanding is that a reasonable amount is already being done, even in respect of financial services, and that's good because it's keeping the regulators talking to each other. And of course, the risk of focusing entirely on the TCA overlooks the fact that there's a lot of cooperation between regulators being done at a much higher level. Obviously, Senelec and the other specialised technical committees report into their international brethren, of which the UK, through the British Standards Institute, still has a role. And so I think there's already quite a lot of regulatory cooperation occurring at a different level to that between the UK and the EU. In respect of passive regulatory divergence or passive regulatory or convergence and divergence, it's already happening. We know that the EU has regulated with extraordinary rapidity over the last few months. We only need to think about the Artificial Intelligence Act, the Corporate Sustainability and Due Diligence Directive, the Platform Work Directive, and somewhat before that, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act. And all of these measures are major measures. They will impact British firms. And so even though we have not regulated to align with those measures, the fact is they will have significant extraterritorial effect. More generally, I think the work that UK and a Changing Europe has been doing on mapping regulatory divergence and alignment, what's very clear is that the active version, i.e. where we are consciously deregulating or diverging from the EU, has basically dropped off a cliff. But as you rightly say, Ignacio, the passive regulatory divergence where the EU steams on ahead and the UK doesn't keep up is a problem. And there's also a legal problem facing the UK, which is that in the past, when we've been required to comply with EU rules and thus to implement in our legal system, we had a shortcut route to do it via Section 2.2 in the European Communities Act. That, of course, that also has disappeared. And one of the very practical things that the UK could do quite quickly is to equip itself with the powers to align via statutory instrument, i.e. secondary law, where it suits the UK's interest.
Thank you very much. Before I bring in David and Stella, I don't know, David Hennig, would you like to come read out your question yourself? Do you want me to read it out for you? And there's also a comment from somebody called Anthony. Not sure who Anthony is. David Hennig, would you like to make your comment? Then we'll come to Anthony if you'd like to make his comment. David.
Hi there. Yeah. Actually, because I had my hand up for something slightly different, but which I'll raise as well. What I was saying on the point of, is there a legal prohibition to a separate agreement? I don't think that there is a legal prohibition on a separate agreement, but there are political issues on the EU side, such as the need for fresh mandates. And again, in regulatory cooperation, there are hooks within the TCA, but there are political restrictions. And I guess I had two questions leading on from that. One was mainly for David Lidington, is how do you the UK debate on the EU tends to be quite sort of mono, almost black and white. It's either we have this deal or that deal. Well, actually, there are many possible deals, there's many shades of grey. How do you get that message into the UK political system? Because I'm a bit unsure how you can sort of bring that in. And I don't know for who, but the EU doesn't seem to like the fact that it's going to have lots of agreements with the UK. So how do you make that sort of acceptable to the EU as well? Sorry, David, I'm probably picking on you.
Right. Before they come in, let's take another question from John Peat. I think you can speak to your question, John Peat of The Economist.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear? Okay, all right, well done. Yeah, no, I think my question may also be for David, but others may have a view. I'd be interested to know what you think about French political instability at the moment. And we don't know what's going to happen to the current to the new French government, what shape it will take. We have no idea what might happen in 2027. And we know from experience that France is usually the toughest negotiator that we deal with. We remember what happened in 63 and 67. And there may be many people in France who say, look, actually de Gaulle was right. We should never have let the Britain in the first place. And we certainly don't want to make any more concessions now. And they'll be watching what happens in the Tory party as well. Do you think we're going to have difficulties with France over the next 3 or 4 years?
Thank you, John. Before we come back to our panelists, I'm going to read out one quick question from somebody called Anthony. I think it's a very good question. To what extent, if at all, do other trade deals, such as the Comprehensive, Progressive, Trans-Pacific Partnership, constrain HMG's ability to negotiate with the EU in areas like phytosanitary? I've certainly heard it said, this is not Anthony, no, this is me talking, I've heard it said that if we did do a deal on SPS with the EU on phytosanitary standards, then we would have to revisit the UK-Australia deal and other bilateral deals we've negotiated. So that's another question. So let's firstly to David, then Stella, then come back to Catherine.
Thanks, Charles. I mean, there's a lot of material there. So let me what I'll try and do is just start with a sort of comment based on Catherine's answer to Ignazio's question, and then move on to what both David Hennig and John Peet were putting to me, because I think they're related. I mean, I perhaps sounded more downbeat than I intended to be in my opening remarks, and I remain on the more optimistic side in terms of what I believe might be attainable. But I think that in some of the sort of pro-European commentary in this country, there is a tendency to overlook the need to persuade the EU that this is worthwhile. To get agreements, whether these are tweaks to the TCA or whether they are parallel sort of self-standing agreements, will mean overcoming an inertia in the institutions and to some extent in member state governments who well, there will be people saying, look, we've got enough on our plate, why do this now? I think that particularly in the Commission, people can be inventive and innovative in setting about new ways in which to fashion agreements, but there will be lawyers sitting in the Bel Aimant saying, sucking their teeth and saying, oh, this is without precedent, Commissioner. It is much better that we stay with the ways that we have always done things. And I think that there is a lot possible, but it does depend on us recognizing that we will need to offer the EU things if we're wanting them to give us stuff that will benefit our country's interests, and that the EU, with leaving aside defence and foreign policy matters where there is still a very large measure of intergovernmentalism, if you're talking about improvements to the trading relationship or SPS or climate, then in practice, you're going to be negotiating with the Commission on a basis of a mandate which member states will have given to the Commission unanimously. And that, having sat at the table, negotiating with the 25 other countries then as to what mandate we would give to the Commission, that process is itself fraught because every member state brings its own interests and its own red lines to that table before you get to the stage where the third country, us, is negotiating with the Commission acting on behalf of the entire European Union. So I remember the TTIP mandate for the Commission, where the French basically blocked any move to begin negotiations until the mandate took out, that we'd all agreed to take out from the mandate any mention of audiovisual relationships and services, because they saw that the dangers of American culture and the English language coming in and swamping the what the Académie Française would tolerate. But so taking that the essential has to be this political will there, and that's directly relevant to what both David and John were asking about. On France, I think that I think it is going to be problematic. Frankly, I think that would have been the case even if Macron and Attal had won a clear majority in the National Assembly, because France tends to be more protectionist than the United Kingdom. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of defence industries, there are important French interests that they will seek to protect. And France, I says, it's pretty comfortable with the idea that there's a good defence and security relationship between the EU and the UK. But when it comes to economic, commercial relationships, actually, they're quite happy for us to be at arm's length, and particularly if the portal for the United Kingdom to deal with the EU is in Paris, and they would see, if they see themselves as the key player within the EU on that would be to the advantage of any French leader. But I think the political instability in France is going to be a real problem, because in the approach to the presidential election, neither Macron nor the various left party leaders are going to want to concede anything which looks as if they are going to give up or dilute French national interest on something like fishing or agriculture, because the Bardella and Le Pen are always going to outflank them on that and take a very hardline nationalist protectionist approach. So French politics seems to me to point in the way of making things difficult. I think one of the very interesting things, to go to what Stella was saying about it's a little bit too early to tell how things are going to pan out, is who is the French commissioner going to be? Because there may well be a wrangle between the National Assembly and the President over who has the right to appoint the French commissioner, and then what portfolio does the French commissioner get? So if you get Thierry Breton or someone of similar mean, again as the internal market commissioner, then I think that installs somebody who is rather keen on EU strategic sovereignty and protectionism in a central role that would not work to the advantage of better commercial relations with the UK. On the other hand, if you get somebody from, let's say, Sweden in there, then I think you're telling a different story. So French politics is important, and the disposition of portfolios within the new commission is going to be important and relevant as well. And John's questions about the UK debate on relations with Europe, I do actually think on this that the new situation after the general election will make that easier. We might come on to my beloved part in due course, but I think that it is easier, and even easier as time goes by, and with greater distance between the referendum and where we are today, for conservative leaders to say, look, actually, it's a different world now. Not be in hoc to the ERG in the way that there was such pressure to be over recent years. But I don't want to count on that. I think there's a sort of a battle and argument to be won there. But how does one actually get, I think David's question, implicit question was a greater understanding within the UK debate of the fact that there are a multiplicity of relationships that are attainable, that there are trade-offs. And this is the big thing we've always ducked in the British debate about our relations with the EU. And I think in part that is by getting the various committees and task forces set up under the TCA and under the Northern Ireland Protocol, functioning with a track record, regular meetings, you get greater understanding of possibilities and each other's positions there, and that starts to influence the behaviour. I think that it would be good if in the new House of Commons there were a committee that looked at strategically at the relationship with the European Union. The House of Lords does a much better job of this than the House of Commons does. Given Nick Thomas-Symonds' appointment at the Cabinet Office, it seems to me that there is a question, which would be the leader of the House and others to ask about what should the provision be for common scrutiny. I think it'd be a mistake just to leave this to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who will have plenty of other stuff to deal with as well. But something that was, I would prefer not to call it the European Scrutiny Committee. I have too many memories appearing there. And one wants to signal a change, but actually some overarching committee on the lines of the Environmental Audit Committee or the PAC that looked right across Whitehall at the interaction and the balance of interest between the United Kingdom and the European Union would seem to me a good idea and a way of broadening the debate. I think in terms of David also asked about how do we avoid the EU, how to address the EU's hang-ups about a multiplicity of agreements, no more Switzerlands. Look, I don't think this is on anybody's agenda yet, but personally, I've always been attracted by the idea of an association agreement. And I in the past, those have always been for countries aspiring to join the EU, but there's nothing in the treaties that requires that. And the EU's recent language about enlargement and how that's handled, I think that opens up possibility of different models here. And I vividly remember a meeting Guy Verhofstadt had with Theresa May in number 10 when we were in the throes of the negotiations, where he sort of raised the issue of association agreement, said the problem with you British is you're all empiricists. We Europeans need a concept. And the way he described it, the beauty of an association agreement is that it's a known legal construct with which the EU and its institutions and member states are all familiar, but you can put into it whatever you want. He said you treat it as a Japanese bento box, and you can have your security and defense relationships in one compartment and your regulatory alignments and mutual recognitions in another box, and your trade relationships in a third, and so on. And you can add to or subtract from them, but it's within the context of an overall familiar legal framework. So that, I think, is something that I would hope that Keir and Nick Thomas-Emmons might be willing to look at.
Thank you, David. Well, Stella, turn to you now. Is that a good idea? Something your colleagues in Parliament would like to do?
Well, David's rather shot my fox, because the other thing I wanted to raise was precisely this question. I think if the priority for the incoming Labour government is absolutely rightly diplomacy, it is rebuilding relationships that can lead to proper conversations about what is possible for mutual gain, then the question for Parliament is what is their role in terms of scrutinising, strengthening and deepening a debate that people for many years now have avoided like the plague. I think there is a collective trauma. I laugh when David talks about being triggered by Bill Cash in many ways. Many of us have in different ways. So he's not had 4 or 5 more years of it, I would say, David. But absolutely, Parliament has not had the same level of engagement, either, frankly, about what is happening in Europe or indeed on how these processes worked out. I was very mindful during the debates about the retained EU law bill, for example, that most parliamentarians did not want to go there. And it wasn't until we actually laid out quite what catastrophe could befall us if everything was deleted by the end of the year and nothing was resolved, that finally people did engage. And frankly, if we are honest, that debate, and I know because I helped lead that campaign, was won in the Lords, not in the Commons. I think that is changing, which is why I go back to it would be a mistake to dismiss the Labour Movement for Europe and the group within the government body now of MPs committed to thinking and talking and working on European issues. But David is absolutely right, other David rather than David sat before us, David Hennig, about understanding and awareness of the range of possibilities. Because the challenge now is to move people on from those debates of 2016 and 2019 to what actually does Europe look like now and what might it be working on in 10 years' time. I'm probably the only parliamentarian, I would wager, who's bothered to read the letter review to think about this question of a fifth freedom around data. And yet that is quite a fundamental question. If it was something we want to interact with, what that could mean. It does all go back to something David Lidington said, and I was casting from it, is political will. And I think that feeds into John's question about the French governments. And as I say, my concern that around Europe, partners we have previously relied on to at least want us to be in the room to talk to in some format, may be under strong pressure at home to make an example of the United Kingdom now that it particularly has a progressive government. I don't just think that's a problem with France, where Macron calling an election was a reaction to the rise of the far right, not a response to it. It's also a challenge with Germans. And in fact, this afternoon, I'm due to be meeting with the German ambassador at a debate as well. They are very concerned and interested in what might be happening and what that means for wider European politics. The concept of political will to even begin a conversation is a very real problem here in the United Kingdom and in Europe. There is, shall I say, an interesting question about what this Parliament may bring in terms of opportunities for those formal conversations, because unless, frankly, people such as yourselves are saying, no, we really do need to be able to look at Europe across the piece, I think David is right. It may get swallowed up in a sense of, well, it can be a question at various events if we need to do it, rather than actually that holistic view that I think we do need to take. That's why I go back to, frankly, it'll be the everyday crises of Brexit that will bring it to bear. You know, if in a month's time, hauliers are saying we're not going to import to the United Kingdom, it's just too expensive, too complicated, too poor as a treatment for our drivers, that will be an issue. You know, no flowers at summer weddings will focus people's minds far more so than any conversation that's currently happening in Brussels about the questions of the SPS agreement. The one other thing that I think it is worth looking at is actually, I would pay tribute to the previous government for finding some rather neat ways of solving some of these challenges. I talk there about that statutory instrument. the British charter mark as opposed to the standard charter mark, the rather glorious thing it did was declare that if you'd met the EU standards, you would be considered to have met the United Kingdom's standards. If one takes that as a metric, then there's actually much more flexibility and much more imagination that can be brought to bear in solving some of the things that may well make businesses think twice about investing in the United Kingdom, that may well make some of these challenges seem so impenetrable. If the tail is wagging the dog rather than the dog determining that it has to be at a certain level, shall we say, so if we as a country start saying, well, actually, we think some of the things that are being done in Europe, they meet our tests, so we'll use them as a proxy, that opens up a number of very pragmatic questions. And Catherine is absolutely right. There is no standing on ceremony here. There is only, frankly, a window of opportunity. And that's where I go back to some slight more pessimism about this, which is if we take too long to start putting in place a structure to look at what could be done with Europe, to look at some of these challenges, to address some of the technicalities, to ask ourselves how far within the CTPP process can we go with resolving some of these things, well, frankly, it'll make very little difference altogether, because the businesses that are right now teetering on whether or not they invest in the United Kingdom, whether they expand their operations or they move fully over to Belgium and to France and to Germany, they've probably got about 18 months of patience in them, which is actually not very long in diplomatic terms. And certainly in parliamentary terms, it's nothing at all. So unless we put in place fairly early on a way of scrutinising and deepening that understanding about what is happening in Europe now, as opposed to what was happening 5 years ago, and we are able to start those conversations about, well, look, where are the common areas of interest when it comes to trade, as well as security, as well as our environment, it will make very little difference. It's why, as the Labour Movement for Europe, we are as tough on those people who want to keep having conversations about rejoin and formal treaty changes, because that is such a lengthy process. And frankly, the British economy and British business does not have that time, as we are determined that this has to be a priority for the incoming Labour government, and we have to reset that relationship and have a more expansive conversation about what is possible, what is in our shared interests, and why it matters. And Catherine is absolutely right. There will be some difficult questions about things like the ECJ, but just as the debate around youth mobility showed, the lack of understanding about what is already happening and what the different models are is the challenge, not the interest in whether something could be done. So I am confident that you have got a new parliament with a new cohort of people who are willing to look at these issues, set against some of the things that might trigger David and I about the resurgence of reform and the resurgence of a politics which is still very much focused on find somebody to blame rather than a solution, and some knotty questions about what parliamentary scrutiny should look like. What I would encourage all people on this call to be thinking about is that question of parliamentary scrutiny, because otherwise we shall all be pondering in the dark. And actually, I think it would be very helpful and good for the debate, not just within government, but more broadly within British society, if we did have a functioning and effective scrutiny process for what is happening that actually our European colleagues could be part of. Because again, I go back to my opening remarks, sometimes in the United Kingdom, we act like Brexit only happened to us, but actually it was a relationship that was severed. So we need to find a way to interact with that relationship. I also think that's not just about parliamentary scrutiny in the United Kingdom, that is about the EU-UK delegation. It is also about bodies like the Council of Europe. It is about all those relationships that we took for granted, facilitated a conversation, because frankly, rebuilding a sense amongst our French counterparts that actually it would probably be a good idea to have the United Kingdom in the room in some format, so what might that look like, will not just happen with one single minister going to Brussels. It will matter because we as a country will show that we are not isolationists, we are internationalists, we have shared concerns, we are going to stand together against Putin, we are going to stand together tackling the climate crisis, and we are going to stand together tackling the question of economic growth.
Thank you very much. Before I turn to Catherine, Stella, how long have we got you for? I know you have to run off quite soon. How many more minutes do we have you for?
Because I have to go and talk to the German ambassador about,
Yes,
I mean, and that's one other thing I would say to people on this call, as somebody who perhaps sometimes has had this as a single issue, there is a lot more interest, and that is very healthy too. I would urge all those who have this technical expertise to keep briefing people, because it does make a difference. It does help move the debate on. It does help those of us who are triggered by the thought of having multiple votes or I mean, I don't know whether the Conservatives might bring Bill Cash back into the Lords, but that would be in the Lords, not in the Commons, and we might get some new debates and some new concerns. David's eyes have just fallen out of his sockets, but you know what I mean? It's like, actually, we do need some fresh voices in this. What I'm here to also say, there is that interest there. So I think people should take heart, but it's at the start of a process of understanding what is possible. And that's a really valuable role that all of you can play about information and guidance about what is happening now.
We have one more question for you, but when do you have to go, Stella, roughly?
Oh, so probably in the next 10 minutes, if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. We'll happy to have you. By the way, I should let people know we only gave you a few hours notice that you were appearing in this webinar anyway. You didn't know until yesterday afternoon, so thank you for appearing at short notice. Catherine, if you could be fairly brief in your response to points of raised, then I come back with one more question for Stella, and then we'll move on.
Thank you. David Hennig's point about EU not lighting lots of agreements with the UK. Yes, you're absolutely right. The EU's always said it doesn't want to have a Swiss arrangement. The Swiss have 120 or so bilateral agreements with the EU, and no bigger framework wraparound of those agreements. And of course, that's what the TCA did when I was describing it in terms of a very large sandwich. But the problem is both its limitation, its strength that there is a wraparound, but it's also its weakness because, of course, there is no role for the ECJ. And if you want to go further, that requires a separate freestanding agreement. In respect of the question about what about the free trade agreements that the UK has already entered into, and will that have an effect on our ability to do a veterinary agreement, SPS agreement with the EU going forward? The answer is it depends on the depth of the SPS agreement. If it's a really deep SPS agreement like the one that the EU has with Switzerland, where there is dynamic alignment with the rules, then yes, it would be very difficult for us to continue with our relationship in respect of, for example, UK and New Zealand. By contrast, if it's a much more shallow SPS agreement, then it would be possible to maintain the UK-New Zealand deal without having to revisit it. But the answer is it's trade-offs. The closer we are, the less paperwork it is, the better for our business. On the other hand, the closer we are, the harder it is to have independent trade deals, which of course was always indicated to be one of the benefits of Brexit.
Thank you very much. So I have one quick question for Stella and one for David. Then we'll have time for a final question if anybody wants to put up their hand or send in a message on comment. My question for Stella. I keep on reading that the parliamentary party in Parliament and the Parliamentary Labour Party and the membership is keener than the leadership to get closer to Europe more quickly than the leadership is. To what extent can members and backbench MPs put pressure on the leadership to move quicker? Would it be counterproductive if you try and put such pressure on them? Are there ways of doing it that would be more productive than counterproductive? My question for David is, the Tory party, David, you know it quite well. Is it going to come back to being sensible from a CR point of view, our definition of sensible on Europe at some point, or do you despair of it if ever doing so? What will it feature in the coming leadership election campaign? Firstly, Stella, we understand, Stella, you have to leave quite soon, but thank you for being with us. Try and answer the question before you leave.
Yeah, look, I obviously in politics there are always ways to catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. You know, there is clearly an interest, and actually what you've seen already from the incoming government is a much more sensible approach to the idea that Europe wants to talk to us and we want to talk to Europe. I don't think this does have to be a combative question. I actually think it goes back to David Hennig's concern about people's understanding of the range of options available. And frankly, that's not a role for the front bench. That is a role for us as the Labour Movement for Europe, I believe, to help inform and educate that debate so that we can move on from debates that make no sense. It makes no sense to debate the single market when we don't know what the single market is going to be. It makes every piece of sense to look at the border, ask what we can do, because our constituents are going to come to us saying we're facing all these crises. And that is what's driving, you know, one of the things, again, I would flag to you is, as a movement, our membership is across the United Kingdom. It's not just in those areas that voted Remain actually members are in areas where they've got manufacturing industries being crippled by all that paperwork. So they want to see practical solutions. It accords with where the public polling is. I mean, frankly, in the areas that voted most strongly for Brexit is the most frustration that it has not resolved itself. But people don't want to go back to a referendum. And I think we all share that sense that that is just, it would take too long. It would be trying to repeat something that doesn't exist anymore. So the interesting question is, what can you do now? There are lots of new MPs and indeed existing ones who are seeing firsthand those challenges and conveying that into the leadership. I think understandably, the leadership don't know until they start being able to have those conversations as a government what interest there is. So I don't think it actually is about a combative approach. I think it, and in general in politics, I don't know whether David would agree this with me or not, his experience of me coming to lobby him, it's to come with solutions and to come with ideas. What I am saying to you is that there are a lot of us who want to see this debate happen now, and a lot of us who want to see that pragmatism being applied, because we can see the benefits to our missions in government, and we can see the benefits to security, and we can see the benefits to the climate as well of working together. So I think it's an open door. Another good example of this, look, we want to set up a great British energy company. That is a huge endeavour. Being part of the North Sea Energy Cooperative would really help that. It would help access tidal power. That is a coordination between European countries, because we're all around the sea. Eminently, lots of those interested in the wind turbine industry and tidal power are interested in those sorts of issues and how we can feed that into the thinking that the government is doing about how to achieve that goal. I think what you're going to see is a lot more talk about Europe, but hopefully with your help, a lot more informed talk about where things can go next, which isn't about, is this rejoin or not, but is about how do we solve the problems? Because what we're very clear of in the Labour Movement of Europe is you can't make Brexit work, but you can fix the problems it has created. So what are those fixes? What are the things that show we can get growth back into the economy because we can have a better trading relationship with our neighbours? Can fight many things in life, but geography really isn't one of them. It does matter how you can interact with your neighbours. And that is an open door in terms of that conversation. Where I think there is going to be space is how quickly that process happens. And that's why I talk about it being Schrodinger's cat, because some of that is outside of the control of our leadership. Nick Thomas-Symonds, I know, has been incredibly diligent, visiting lots of European capitals, building up those relationships. Keir is making a very strong statement. We've got the European EPC meeting next week. We are clearly making this a priority. But if you are dealing with the Hungarian presidency, it's a fundamentally different offer to dealing with Poland. And that is outside of our control. So obviously, that is going to affect the speed at which things happen. But I wouldn't be doing this, Charles, if I didn't think there was a possibility for progress, because I think that's going to be a very strong conversation to have. I think where that gets us in terms of whether there might be pieces of legislation, to say this question about parliamentary scrutiny, whether there are opportunities, for example, when you come to the Great British Energy Company, to put in caveats about working with other European nations on tidal power that show the benefits of cooperation. That's where I think the progress will be made. And that's, the British public are eminently behind that. They're ahead of the politicians in saying, look, get on, if you can sort some of this out, please do, because we can see the damage that it's doing. And I think that's going to be a message for the Conservative Party as well, because after all, at every single opportunity where people have tried to say, oh, you're taking us back into the European Union, the public kind of shrug. The debate has moved on to what do we do to sort these problems out.
Much. I've given David his question already, but let me add on another question from Sebastian Maillard. What would an EU-UK security pact look like? And then I've got a final question for Catherine after that, a more technical question. But David, over to you.
Thanks. Do you want me to deal with the security one as well as the Conservative Party one?
If you can, yes.
Right. No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm very broad in agreement with what Stella just said. So we've been shooting each other's foxes this afternoon. But look, there's going to be a bit of a stir in the Conservative Party with the leadership election. There'll be some people who will be looking for opportunities to say that one of their rivals is out to betray Brexit and so on. There are people still in Parliament and in the constituency parties who won't change their views, and this will get tied up with the internal Conservative debate about whether the answer to the election result is to align more closely to Reform UK. And I mean, it won't surprise anybody, I think, if I say that's not a proposition I agree with. But but actually, there will be a debate about that. My personal view is that you deal with that by having effective policies that actually are going to deliver some results on the issues that Reform UK defectors from the Conservatives care about. And immigration be one, that sort of economic growth, people economically left behind is another. But I think that it was striking that Brexit did not really feature as an issue in the campaign at all. There was some desultory comments early on from some in my party saying, "Oh, Keir Starmer will betray Brexit," but it was hyped usually by the Express or the Mail. It wasn't something I often heard Rishi Sunak or his ministers talk about, because they knew that this was not something the British people saw as a priority or something that there were tons of votes to harvest. So I am not in the despairing camp. There's some of my sort of like-minded colleagues and amongst the more centrist Tories who, you know, have almost given up. But I think that there are real causes for greater optimism on this. We've had 2 years now where the opinion polls have been consistently showing that roughly 60% of the electorate believes that, looking back with hindsight, Brexit has done harm to the country. As Stella said, it doesn't mean that people are demanding a second referendum. Actually, it's the last thing they want to, and frankly, it's the last thing the 27 want to confront at the moment. I've always thought that it's when my children's generation are running the country that issue might come up, depending on what the EU looks like, what the UK look like then. And my children's generation aren't going to be running the country, despite the age of some of the PLP. My children's generation aren't going to be running the country properly for another decade, at least. So you know, that's a while away. So we can actually say, look, we're out. That decision was taken. The question is, what do we do now with the problems and the opportunities that we've got in front of us? And I think that actually we get the sort of parliamentary committee established that we've been talking about. If we get the cross-party or the all-party committee involving the European Parliament and the Houses of Lords and Commons working effectively, regularly, routinely, that will all help improve the quality of the debate. But you're also seeing, on top of that 60% for the last 2 years, there's a gradual generational shift. You know, every year the electorate has fewer people in it who voted in the 2016 referendum and more people who were too young to vote at the time of the 2016 referendum. And you know, in general terms, they are more internationalist, more European in their outlook, more frustrated at the fact they can't now look to work for part of their career, travel as freely into other European countries as was once the case. Business, as I think both Stella and Catherine said earlier, I think is a little bit bolder now than it was, because business is having to confront the practical consequences of Brexit. And so there are more heads being willing to be raised above the parapet. I was very struck when, as chairman of the Conservative European Forum, we ran an inquiry into the TCA and what might be done to improve the relationship, by the readiness of quite senior leaders in business to come and speak to us. So we're just a small group connected with Conservatives, and that I thought was very encouraging, that business was wanting to have that practical discussion about where we go from here. So I am pretty optimistic, but I think it's going to be a gradual process. And at the end of the day, if the Conservative Party wants to get back into government, then it has to address the fact that what the election results showed is that it's become far too dependent exclusively on the votes of older people. And it's that Conservative support amongst not just school and college leavers, but amongst people in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, who have family and career responsibilities that are active, mature members of society, is falling to dangerously low levels. To part of winning those people back is actually showing a more practical approach to European policy, hard-headed about British national interest, but accepting that you need to cooperate with other countries in order to get your interests met in today's world. And so I think that electoral imperative is going to shift the Conservative Party, what I would see as the right
David,
direction.
sorry to interrupt. Could you come to the security pact question?
Security pact. I think that it'll probably be incremental. My ideal world, we would have observer status at the Foreign Affairs Council, be a regular participant. But I think what we'll have is probably something with an overarching commitment to work and consult closely together. What I would like to see that include are some practical examples of where we can work together on, say, the Western Balkans, where the UK has been very active in the past, but we've been rather excluded recently. And I think that on defence industries, we've got one of the big challenges ahead of us, as I said earlier. And I think it'll be a real prize if we can get a defence security pact with the European Union, where we not only have slightly better police and justice cooperation than we do now, things like extradition, but also where our defence industries are accepted as a sort of EU plus when it comes to privileged access to working on European defence projects.
Thank you very much. We've got a question for Catherine from Ignacio Garcia Bercero again. It's quite a short technical question. Normally, SPS chapters in FTAs do not limit capacity to regulate or seek to impose substantive regulatory standards. Is there anything in the CPTPP or the British deals with New Zealand and Australia that prevent Britain from aligning with the EU standards? That's quite an important question, Catherine.
Yes, thank you. If it would be helpful, I could just say something on the defence, but just to deal with Ignacio's question briefly,
Please
I haven't looked at the CPTPP with sufficient care to be able to answer that question concretely. David Hennig, who's been on the call, thinks not, and certainly I think it's the case that given that a lot of SPS standards are rooted in WTO, the WTO agreements, as long as nothing in the EU SPS standards contravenes those, it seems unlikely that there would be any reason why the UK could not align with EU standards, assuming we want to do that. So I would say, and given that EU standards are high, it seems extremely unlikely that EU standards would contravene any SPS standards, but I'm willing to be contradicted if I've got that point wrong. Specifically on the Defence Security Pact question, I would just say, building on what David has said, I suspect it will be incremental, and I suspect it will be unexciting in some ways. So, for example, it would be sensible if the UK had some relationship with some of the EU agencies like Europol, Eurojust, Frontex. None of these things is going to set anyone's pulse racing, but it would be a way of building up trust. I think we could do quite a lot more on cybersecurity, which of course is going to be the biggest, one of the biggest challenges going forward. And that would be an opportunity for us to work with the EU where the challenges are common. I think there will also be some major work on energy security, and energy security may be some form of shared infrastructure, particularly over offshore wind. And I think there will also be, hopefully down the line, David talked about cooperation over the Balkans, but maybe some involvement in the European Defence Agency. You'll note I'm using a loose term like involvement, because of course that can take many forms. And of course it may be that we can participate with the EU in any practical support in connection with Ukraine. We already have done a great deal about training of the military, and this probably is something that we could do going forward.
Thank you very much. I think we've run out of questions now, which is fine because we've run out of time as well. Let me just finish by just highlighting, for those who are interested, 3 recent and future CR publications which are very relevant to this conversation. My colleague Aslak Berg, one of our senior economists, has published a paper last week on dynamic alignment, how it would work, what the different models are, and which models might work for the UK and which might not work. It's well worth looking at that paper. It's on our website. Yesterday, I published an open letter to Keir Starmer with 10 suggestions on how he could improve the relationship with the EU. Do please read it. And then John Peet, who was on the call earlier, is writing an essay for us on the historical overview of the UK-EU relationship, which is going to be published in about a week's time. So thanks to John for writing that excellent piece of work. But thanks also to Stella, who had to leave us early. Thanks to David, thanks to Catherine, thanks to everybody for joining us. There'll be many more seminars on this subject. One thing I take away from this is that there's a lot of expertise in Britain still on the European Union, but it's not in the government. That's not a criticism of Labour or indeed of any government, but because ministers and officials no longer go to Brussels and Strasbourg and Luxembourg, they don't know what's going on. But people outside the government, businesses, think tanks, universities, and so on, do actually know a bit about what's happening in the EU. So it's important that people in government have the chance to ask people outside government who know something what's going on, so we can help to reduce that knowledge deficit, which is quite a big problem in the UK-EU relationship. That's enough from me. Thanks very much to everybody. Hope to see you again soon. Bye.